Today I'm going to talk about untangling imposter syndrome because imposter syndrome is something that many of my clients bring. So it's relevant to a lot of people, and I, as you will see, have my own ideas on imposter syndrome. I think it's a much bigger issue than it normally is assumed. Along with this live, there is a free guide that you can claim if this speaks to you and you want to start working with it on your own. The guide is called The Same Untangling Imposter Syndrome, the same as today's session. And what you have to do to get hold of the guide: A, please comment untangling underneath this video. Don't worry, your spelling doesn't have to be perfect. And B, please message me on Messenger to my Messenger link, which you will find in the post that goes with this live, m.me, Sweeney Susanna. Please message me the same word, untangling. So two things you have to do to get hold of the free guide. So in this training today, I want to talk to you about what imposter syndrome is, how it works, how it affects you, and how you can make an excellent start to undo imposter syndrome working by yourself. So when I talk about imposter syndrome, I'm not speaking about theory. This is something that I lived with for many years. In my teens, in my 20s, I had absolutely no belief in myself. I was terrified to learn new things. I was convinced I wouldn't manage them. For example, the English language, when they started teaching English in school, I had absolutely no confidence that I could manage a second foreign language. And it wasn't coming from poor performance in school. I was actually doing really well in school, but there was this feeling deep inside that felt like I just couldn't do those things. So I was judging myself and I felt unworthy, I felt insecure and unsure of myself. So, for example, when I took my school leaving exams, at that stage I was 17, going on 18, something like that. I convinced myself that I would fail all the science subjects, that I would fail math, physics, chemistry. But as it happened, I finished in the top 5%. But still, I couldn't let that feeling in. And even with the next project and the next project and the one after that, I still felt the same way. The achievement totally didn't count. It's not like that would sink in, that I was able and that I could do these things, but I would always come back to that self-doubt. And I think that's one of those key features in imposter syndrome, is that self-doubt. And underneath that self-doubt, there is a lot of fear. I know there was for me. And that's what creates a pattern where it rolls on and on and on. So people with imposter syndrome very often are serial course takers. They always feel like they have to improve and keep improving and learn more, where in actual fact it's not about the learning element, it's much more about the feeling that sits underneath. So a key moment for me when I knew I had moved beyond was many years ago when I went back to college to do a higher diploma. This must be in the very early 2000s. I had been out of education for a good while, and I really thought I wouldn't pass. I wouldn't be able to do this. I was wondering, would I come away with a qualification at the end? But what happened was that actually I finished top of the class. So that's when I knew I had made a difference with my inner work, and I could finally let myself enjoy it. But that didn't come instantly. It took me a long time before imposter syndrome would loosen its grip. And underneath that was for a very long time a feeling that I'm not enough. So what I did was I over-delivered at work, because when you never feel enough, you work extra hard to deliver. I put in more energy, more effort, more everything, and still I felt like I was a fraud. So it didn't make sense. I kept it hidden from a lot of people in my life, the ones that weren't in my close circle. They never knew that I was struggling with this. And on the outside, I did come across as confident, but that didn't reflect how I felt inside. So every now and then, um, I still dip a toe in that familiar fear that I'm not going to be able to measure up, but no longer do I jump into the pool, right? I think that's a good metaphor where you can get to when you do your work around imposter syndrome. It may still show up, you're still dipping your toe in, but you're no longer jumping in headfirst into a lake of fear and not feeling good enough. So one of the hardest parts about imposter syndrome isn't what it makes you feel, it's what it keeps you from doing. So even though I finished in the top 5%, as I shared with you in my exams, so I could have studied medicine, I could have studied psychology, I could have studied anything I wanted to at the time, but those thoughts never crossed my mind, because there was always that anxiety there, always that fear there, that I wouldn't manage those things anyway. I was completely disconnected from my own potential. And I think that that's a lesser known element in imposter syndrome, that can be there, that this underlying deep-seated fear can be there. So I I just couldn't believe that I would do well on any of those courses. And I quietly closed doors because of that fear. I didn't even realize that some of those doors were there at the time. Imposter syndrome will convince you to dream smaller, to reach less, and to play it safe going through life. And then one day you look back and you wonder what might have been if you only believed that you could at the time. So my own connection with the topic is in part why I created this training, but also the fact that a lot of clients come with the imposter syndrome. And believe me, I know my way around it very well from my own experience as well as from my work. So I understand very well what it feels like to carry that burden and to feel like you don't belong in the room. The disconnect is brutal between a reality where you're actually very likely high performing and that underlying feeling that tells you you're not enough. But it can change piece by piece, it can be rewired. I did it the hard way, the way I'm going to show you in the guide, and that's what we will be talking about today. Yeah, so I think that imposter syndrome is often misunderstood, especially in the business world, where it's often sort of presented as just a small thing. It can be brushed off as something that's just like a mindset glitch, a little bit of natural self-doubt that always creeps up when you're starting into a new project, and that you can push through by changing your mindset and maybe just doing the thing anyway, the thing you're afraid of. And they sort of tell you it's something that everyone feels at certain crossroads, especially high achievers. And while most of that may be true, I personally don't believe that that's the whole story at all. That's not the version of imposter syndrome that I know, and not from my own experience and not from the experience of many of my clients that I've worked with. In reality, what can sit underneath imposter syndrome is outright childhood trauma, or at the very least, the dream destroyer programming or anxiety personality programming. I use these terms interchangeably. And that is programming that comes from childhood. So where you've developed certain coping mechanisms, where you've maybe copied your caregiver's ways of being in the world. And imposter syndrome can have almost like it can be a solace for kids. Maybe those kids get a lot of rejection at home. Maybe they're not loved unconditionally. Maybe they're loved only conditionally for their performance, or when they submit to what's going on in the family, or the family life is outright traumatic. So they find themselves solace in school and with their performance in school, the one area where they know they can do well. And so then this thing develops out of that there's an exaggerated emphasis put on their performance in school. But because they don't feel good about themselves deep inside, it becomes this, I'm never good enough, and I don't think I can manage it the next time, etc., etc. So basically a chronic inner conflict where you perform well, but you don't feel it. You achieve, but it doesn't feel like it's you who's achieving. Looking confident on the outside, but inside just waiting to be found out. And that's the crucial underlying belief about self. I am not enough. I am not good enough. I don't measure up. And it doesn't matter what it is you're dealing with, that's the underlying feeling, very characteristic of imposter syndrome. So here are some of the things that you do when you have this kind of imposter syndrome. You're competent, you constantly question whether you belong, you constantly compare yourself to colleagues, and you never come out well in that comparison. You brace for being exposed as a fraud. You can't feel your achievements, even when others praise you. Promotions, visibility, public speaking, pricing your work, all of those things you dread, and they become very difficult. You may over-prepare, you may rework everything, striving for perfection, so that you come across as perfect, and then it never feels that way anyway. And naturally, all of that comes at a cost to you, right? Where you're holding back maybe from leadership or high stake opportunities, you're very likely to not put yourself forward for those when you have that deeply held belief that you're not enough, that you don't measure up. So I've had more than one client confide in me that they deliberately chose jobs for which they were overqualified, and they knew very well that they were overqualified for those jobs, but it felt safer than working on the edge and exposing themselves when they didn't feel they could measure up. Undercharging, discounting your work is another thing that happens around imposter syndrome, out of the sense of not feeling enough, not feeling worthy. So for me, that meant that for many years, I worked in an environment where I earned very little, where there was a very clear ceiling on my income. And I tolerated that because deep inside, I didn't feel enough. I didn't feel good enough to be compensated well for my work. Burnout from trying to prove yourself. Another one that I would have walked into, and I know clients have too, where I experienced near burnout. There were those moments over the years where I walked into that rather, by working too hard. I brought myself to the edge of burnout. You may be avoiding visibility because it feels emotionally unsafe. So what does that mean? You may not speak out in meetings. And we all know how important that is, how you come across in certain meetings, how you're perceived when you contribute and you bring in your ideas. It's very important in today's business world. So essentially, by not making yourself visible and not taking that step, you're undermining your career opportunities as well. Speaking anxiety and imposter syndrome can go hand in hand. When you're terrified about what your audience thinks, will they judge you? What will they think about you? And are you enough to be speaking in public at all? An inability to receive or let in praise, promotions, compliments, they just don't feel like they are true of you. You may be immediately following up with a deflecting comment. Sure, but it was only a small thing, or sure, but everybody else could do what I did. Those kinds of things, sort of putting yourself down in a way, or putting the attention back on the other side when they congratulate you. So these can be telltale signs of imposter syndrome, so watch out for those. Yeah, and the myth that imposter syndrome is a mindset issue, I want to talk about that a little more. It's a confidence problem and it isn't a confidence problem, right? So when it's framed as a confidence problem, that really tr tries to transcend the fact that there are deeper emotional issues at play very often. I'm not saying the mild form of imposter syndrome doesn't exist. I'm sure it does exist. But people who struggle with imposter syndrome for a longer period of time, it's much more likely for them that there are more deep-seated emotional issues underneath that are not just a small confidence or mindset issue. And when you have these underlying issues and it's still framed as a confidence problem, what that tries to do is to jump that gap, to somehow bridge that gap um, between, trying to forget about the painful underlying feelings, essentially, or maybe not even being fully aware of them. And it's not just about being insecure. It doesn't necessarily get fixed with affirmations, journaling, knowing better. And even if you already know you have underlying emotional issues and you understand those patterns perhaps perfectly well, you may still be feeling it every day and you may find it impossible to change it. So the way I talk about that is that this kind of imposter syndrome is based on faulty emotional code. And this is the sort of emotional code that we pick up early in life through faulty childhood programming. It runs in the background. And even when the evidence says you're doing well, this programming that was laid down early says the opposite. It says you are not worthy, you are not enough, you are not good enough, and you cannot just jump over that because it's so strong, and it's so strong because it has been encoded in a certain way. You learned that being seen, being praised, or being valued comes with a risk. You may have been at the receiving end of rejection or criticism frequently during early years, perhaps by your caregivers directly. And you may have absorbed messages like, don't get too confident, stay humble, who do you think you are? You'll never be good enough. And the way your brain responds to that is it encodes this information because we have a biological expectation that we learn from our parents the best ways of getting by in this life. So we rely on them to teach us the right stuff. We absorb everything like a sponge and we start living from that place. So this encoding is very deeply absorbed into the system, and that means that success is now tagged as a danger, and this survival response of tagging the memory in that way can stay with you for life, unless you start working with it and start undoing it. So this is the sort of stuff that we work on in my Optimise program, where we essentially pull the tablecloth from underneath a house of cards. So imagine this childhood programming as a house of cards that is very stable, but only as long as we don't pull the tablecloth. And when we do, it can all collapse, and then you can rebuild it in a way that supports you much better. As long as that programming is there and is not taken apart, you have zero conscious control over this process. It will kick off at the slightest trigger. This is also part of the biological programming, because your brain believes this information is crucial for your survival. It happens in older brain regions. That's what you have to understand. You cannot talk yourself out of that by using your prefrontal cortex. So all the insight, all the understanding that you perhaps already bring to the topic doesn't necessarily deal with the feelings at all. You can probably reduce them somewhat by using this top-down regulation, but you won't be able to free yourself from the programming entirely in that way. So that's for the Optimise program. However, that doesn't mean that you can't do anything to support yourself and already start on the journey. You can change some things already. So let me see where I am in my presentation. Let's talk about the 7 steps that I recommend that you can start with for rewiring imposter syndrome. So either you can now take your notes, or this is where you can request the free guide so that you can save yourself from taking these notes. Remember, if you want the guide, there are 2 things I ask you to do. Message me the word untangling, as well as commenting untangling under the video. 2 things. Now let me talk you through those steps. Number 1, adopt an observer mindset. So this is very much how I did my work the hard way over the years. It's not all that hard either. It's just that it will be, I'm using the word hard because when you compare it to what we do inside Optimise, there's a lot more work involved with this, and it will take a longer time, but that doesn't mean it doesn't work. It works very, very well. And what you're doing is you're adopting a stance of mindful awareness. And what is that? Mindful awareness is, imagine it as there's a little observer sitting on your shoulder. We all have the inbuilt capacity to observe ourselves as we're going through life, as we're going through every day, as we're thinking, as we're feeling, as we're making decisions, as we're acting. And so the role of this observer is to act as a witness to all of that and to report back to you with their observations, not with their judgments. This is very important. It's not about judging what you're witnessing, what you're observing. It's purely information we want from this observer, because information is power. So no fixing, no judging, simply tracking the patterns and reporting back to you. Now, this is a practice that I recommend to all of my clients and everyone I work with to adopt this practice, because it gives you a lot more choice in life when you have this information about your patterns. It won't take you any extra time, not even 10 minutes a day, because you simply develop it as a parallel practice to everything you're doing in your day, to how you're going through life, essentially. And so here is step number 2. You're watching for the concrete patterns linked to imposter syndrome. So ask yourself, how do I do imposter syndrome? Because it will be different from person to person, how exactly that operates. And you want to become curious about it. You don't want to judge, you want to become curious how you function, how exactly you navigate this. So here are some examples how you may be doing imposter syndrome, but that's not a comprehensive list either, but just as an inspiration for the kinds of things you may be looking out for. Maybe you feel relief when a meeting is cancelled because you fear being put in the spotlight when you have to speak. Maybe you reread your emails and rework them multiple times before you send them because you want them to come across as perfect and they don't feel good enough unless you do that. Maybe you feel physically tense with fear before calls or presentations, or maybe you have some other physical manifestation of that fear, maybe burning, maybe a churning in the stomach, maybe a tingling, any physical symptom that is relevant for you, observe it. You downplay your contributions even when you did most of the work. That can be another characteristic here. You may assume that when you receive praise, that this praise is exaggerated or fake, and you may not believe it for that reason. Maybe you can't let any compliments in. Observe yourself. How are you with compliments when people say something positive, even about, oh, you look nice today, or I really like that new jacket you're wearing, it really suits you. Observe yourself. How do you feel when you receive a compliment? Can you let it in? Can you not let it in? And how do you respond and how do you react? Maybe you say yes to things that you're asked to do, and maybe then afterwards you feel resentment or dread once you've said yes. But maybe you say yes from a place of not feeling enough and then not feeling entitled to not say yes, right? So observe yourself. Maybe you avoid applying for jobs, promotions, opportunities that truly match your level of skill and experience. And maybe you do that because you're ruled by self-doubt, because you don't feel you would deserve them or you would actually do well in those roles. Maybe you compare yourself, feel that others are more capable, or rather, I should say, judge that others are more capable, more credible, more confident, and maybe there are some others that you idealize and that you feel are competent and all the good things while you are not in the comparison. Maybe you feel anxious that someone will find out that you just don't measure up and you're not as good as they think you are. That can be that real fear and imposter syndrome that any moment you will be found out. Maybe you hide your real opinions in order to avoid criticism. Maybe you believe that others are doing it right, that you are behind. Maybe you over prepare for everything just in case. Maybe you don't speak up in meetings unless you're absolutely 100% certain of what to say. So watch out for those. Number 3 then becomes tune into the feeling that's running underneath. So we've already touched into that. There can be a feeling of fear running underneath. There certainly is a feeling of not feeling enough running underneath. Ask yourself, what emotion am I feeling right now? And where is this emotion in my body? How does my body tell me it's there? So then the answer you should receive to that question is something to do with body sensations, like a tingling in the chest, like a burning in the stomach, something like that. Step number 4, trace it back. The next question you ask yourself is, where might I have learned to act or feel in this particular way? When in my life did I first feel this? When I was young. What did I learn about trying, failing, standing out? What did I learn maybe about expressing myself? And what role did criticism play when I was a child? And what role did praise play when I was a child? Now, all of these observations, in step number 5, I would encourage you to write down, even if you just write down a few bullet points, but it's so easy to forget. We forget so quickly. So any of these insights, think of them as gold. They're absolute gold. They give you power in your hands. Information is power. So do write them down to hold on to this gold. Don't let the gold run through your fingers like quicksand. Write down your emotions, your patterns, your body sensations, everything you've observed so far. Number 6 of the steps. Here we come to rewiring your response. Ask yourself, what if I could sit through these unpleasant feelings and body sensations that hold me back? What if I could sit through them? Can I maybe just bear this discomfort just until it passes? So you have to understand that every emotion, every body sensation rises, peaks, and then abates. Nothing is here to stay permanently. So it will always be on the move how you feel. So how would it be if perhaps you can rely on that and just sit through it until it abates? How bad would that be, really? Just to sit through that. And then you ask yourself, is there a possibility of getting what I want? Now that I've sat through it, is there a possibility of getting or doing what I want anyway? And what if what I want to do or claim, what if that actually could work out? Is there a chance that this can perhaps work out? So you do a bit of journaling on that once you've sat through the difficult feeling. Again, I would recommend to work with the journal, write it down. And then move on to step number 7, which is future pacing. Decide what you want to do differently. What risks are you prepared to take perhaps the next time? It will feel like a risk. This may be speaking out in meetings or taking that difficult step to apply for that promotion that you should really apply for. It won't feel easy. All the old feelings will come up. But you can teach yourself to sit through them, to come out the other side, and then to approach it, and approach it with a future vision. So rehearse it beforehand mentally. For example, the next time that I notice this fear, I will focus on the body sensation, not the emotion. That can make it much more bearable. Then I will stay present. I will breathe through it, and once the feeling has abated, I will act anyway, and I will do exactly the thing that I was afraid of to start with, while I'm remembering that this fear comes from old emotional code and not actually from the current situation. and I will take the next step at that point, even if it feels uncomfortable to do so. I will commit to myself and I will take that next step. So, of course, all of those 7 steps will go in a cycle. You will do that more than once. It won't be resolved by just doing it once. It will be resolved by making this process part of your life, really building that observation in and those practices in. If you stay consistent with them and do all the things, observing without judgment, tracking the emotions, tracking them back to body sensations, reflecting on where they came from in the first place, practicing sitting through them, practicing the new responses, it's then that you will start to notice change bit by bit, step by step. Your self-perception can then begin to change. The feelings will become less intense, the doubt will begin to quieten down, and your confidence can begin to grow on the inside. So if you would like my guide, again, so that you have it at your fingertips, you know how to claim your guide. 2 things you have to do. First of all, comment Untangle or Untangling underneath this video. Secondly, message me. My messenger link is in this post. The same word, Untangle or Untangling. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. And other than that, I shall see you next week at the same time, next Friday, same time, in the next live, and I'm looking forward to seeing you then. If you're watching on replay, kindly leave a hashtag replay underneath, or make yourself known in some other way, leave a comment underneath. That tells the algorithm that we're doing something useful here. So I would really appreciate your help with that. Looking forward to seeing you next week. Have a great one. Bye-bye.